The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Blackstone's training grounds as Drill Sergeant Elena Vasquez adjusted her campaign hat for what she believed would be the last time. After 18 months of watching recruits graduate while her own potential remained buried beneath layers of bureaucratic dismissal, she had typed her resignation letter the night before. It sat in her desk drawer, waiting for the right moment to end a military career that had become a daily reminder of institutional blindness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But fate had other plans. In less than 6 hours, Elena would face an impossible mission that would transform her from an overlooked instructor into a legend, whose name would be spoken with reverence throughout the armed forces. This is the story of how a drill sergeant they said wasn't leadership material became the soldier who redefined what leadership actually means. The pre-dawn humidity at Fort Blackstone clung to everything like a second skin, making the Georgia summer feel more like a sauna than a military installation. Elena Vasquez stood at attention in the back corner of the weekly staff meeting, her presence as overlooked as the motivational posters peeling from the conference room walls. Her pristine uniform bore the 3 chevrons and crossed rifles of a drill sergeant, but to most of the officers in the room, she might as well have been invisible furniture. Colonel Marcus Reed dominated the front of the room with the kind of commanding presence that made junior officers scramble to take notes on his every word. His voice boomed across the cramped space as he reviewed the week's training schedules, each announcement delivered with the theatrical authority of someone who had never questioned his right to command others. The morning briefing covered routine matters, graduation ceremonies, and the endless paperwork that kept military bureaucracy functioning. But Elena's attention drifted to the stack of incident reports in her lap. She had spent the previous evening analyzing training accidents from the past year, identifying patterns that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. 3 recruits had suffered injuries during the obstacle course because the safety protocols hadn't been updated since the equipment was modified. 2 more had been hospitalized during combat simulations because the medical support positioning was inadequate for the new training scenarios. Elena had documented every failure, cross-referenced every near miss, and developed comprehensive solutions that could prevent future casualties. Her recommendations sat in a manila folder that had been collecting dust on Colonel Reed's desk for 6 weeks. Every time she had requested a meeting to discuss the proposals, she had been told that training modifications required extensive review by senior personnel. The unspoken message was clear: drill sergeants didn't develop policy, they simply implemented decisions made by others. Elena's expertise in training methodology, earned through countless hours of study and observation, was considered irrelevant by officers who viewed her primarily as an enforcement mechanism rather than a thinking professional. Master Sergeant David Chen commanded the room's attention as he reviewed the morning's assignments, his weathered face reflecting 2 decades of military service. Chen was one of the few senior enlisted personnel who treated Elena with professional respect, but even he operated within a system that limited her opportunities for advancement. The conversation turned to the upcoming visit from the Pentagon's training evaluation team, a group of officials who would spend 3 days assessing Fort Blackstone's effectiveness in preparing soldiers for combat deployment. Elena knew this. Evaluation represented a crucial opportunity for the installation. Recent reports had questioned whether traditional training methods were adequately preparing soldiers for modern warfare's complexities. The evaluation team would be looking for innovation, adaptability, and evidence that Fort Blackstone was evolving beyond outdated approaches. Unfortunately, the officers responsible for impressing the visitors seemed more concerned with polishing their presentations than addressing fundamental training deficiencies. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez entered the room with obvious urgency. her usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled anxiety. She whispered something to Colonel Reed that made his face darken with concern. The room fell silent as Martinez addressed the assembled staff, her voice tight with professional worry. The Pentagon evaluation had been moved up by 72 hours due to a scheduling conflict, meaning the assessment team would arrive this afternoon instead of next week. The news sent ripples of panic through the room. Presentations weren't ready, training demonstrations hadn't been rehearsed, and several key personnel were on leave. Elena watched as officers scrambled to reorganize their carefully planned schedules, their conversations revealing just how unprepared Fort Blackstone actually was for serious scrutiny. The evaluation would include live training exercises, policy reviews, and detailed assessments of safety protocols, exactly the areas where Elena's recommendations could have made a significant difference. Colonel Reed's voice cut through the chaos with the kind of forced calm that barely concealed growing desperation. The evaluation team would observe 3 critical training scenarios: urban combat simulation, advanced obstacle course navigation, and emergency medical response under fire. Each exercise would be conducted with live recruits, while Pentagon officials took detailed notes on methodology, safety procedures, and instructor effectiveness. The reputation of every officer in the room depended on those observations going smoothly. Elena's stomach tightened as she realized the magnitude of the challenge facing Fort Blackstone. The urban combat simulation used outdated tactics that didn't reflect current battlefield realities. The obstacle course suffered from the safety deficiencies she had documented months earlier. The medical response protocols were inefficient and potentially dangerous in high-stress scenarios. Unless significant changes were implemented immediately, the evaluation would expose weaknesses that could result in the installation losing its training mission entirely. Master Sergeant Chun approached Elena after the meeting disbanded, his expression mixing frustration with grudging acknowledgement. He had reviewed her safety recommendations the previous month and privately agreed with most of her conclusions. But implementing changes required approval from officers who seemed more interested in maintaining appearances than improving effectiveness. Chun understood that Elena's insights could significantly improve training outcomes, but the institutional resistance to suggestions from drill sergeants remained a formidable obstacle. The conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, who had been desperately searching for solutions to the evaluation crisis. Martinez had heard rumors about Elena's comprehensive analysis of training deficiencies, though she had never taken the time to review the recommendations personally. With less than 8 hours before the Pentagon team arrived, Martinez was finally ready to consider input from sources she had previously ignored. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The desperation in her voice was unmistakable as she asked Elena to present her findings to the emergency planning session. Elena felt a surge of vindication mixed with apprehension. After months of being dismissed and overlooked, her expertise was suddenly being sought by the same officers who had consistently marginalized her contributions. The irony wasn't lost on her that it required a crisis to make her knowledge valuable to people who should have been listening all along. She gathered her documentation and prepared to enter a room where her ideas would receive serious consideration. For the first time in her military career, the emergency planning session revealed just how poorly prepared Fort Blackstone actually was for rigorous evaluation. Officers who had spent months focusing on superficial improvements suddenly faced the reality that their training programs contained fundamental flaws. The urban combat scenarios relied on tactics that had been obsolete for years. The medical response protocols assumed ideal conditions that never existed in actual combat situations. The obstacle course configurations created unnecessary risks that could result in serious injuries during the demonstration. Elena spread her analysis across the conference table, her documentation revealing patterns that others had somehow failed to notice. The injury reports showed clear correlations between equipment modifications and accident rates. The efficiency studies demonstrated how minor protocol adjustments could significantly improve training outcomes. The safety assessments identified specific vulnerabilities that could be addressed with relatively simple changes. Her work represented months of careful observation and analysis, distilled into actionable recommendations that could transform Fort Blackstone's training effectiveness. Colonel Reed studied the documents with growing amazement, his expression shifting from skepticism to grudging respect as he recognized the thoroughness of Elena's research. The recommendations weren't theoretical suggestions from someone unfamiliar with practical training realities. They were detailed proposals developed by an instructor who understood both the technical requirements and the human factors that determine success or failure. Elena had identified problems that experienced officers had overlooked and developed solutions that could be implemented immediately. The room's atmosphere changed as officers realized that Elena's insights might represent their best hope for surviving the evaluation. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez began asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and resource requirements. Master Sergeant Chun offered logistical support for the proposed modifications. Even Colonel Reed acknowledged that Elena's analysis had identified critical issues that needed immediate attention. For the first time in her career, Elena found herself being treated as a subject matter expert rather than a subordinate whose opinions were irrelevant. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Elena as she watched officers scramble to understand recommendations they had been ignoring for months. Her resignation letter remained in her desk drawer, but the morning's developments had created an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate her actual capabilities. The Pentagon evaluation would either validate her expertise or confirm that the military had no place for innovative thinking from unexpected sources. Either way, Elena was about to discover whether competence could overcome institutional prejudice when the stakes were high enough. The clock on the conference room wall showed 0900 hours, meaning the evaluation team would arrive in less than 6 hours. Elena's recommendations could be implemented if everyone worked with unprecedented coordination and efficiency. The urban combat scenarios could be updated using more realistic tactics. The obstacle course configurations could be modified to address safety concerns. The medical response protocols could be streamlined to reflect actual battlefield conditions. Success would require admitting that previous approaches had been inadequate and trusting a drill sergeant to guide critical changes. Colonel Reed made the decision that would define Fort Blackstone's future and Elena's career. The installation would implement Elena's recommendations immediately, regardless of traditional hierarchies or established procedures. She would supervise the modifications personally, with full authority to make whatever changes were necessary to ensure successful evaluation outcomes. The officers who had dismissed her expertise for months would now depend on her knowledge to save their careers and preserve the installation's mission. Elena felt the weight of unexpected responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack. Everything she had learned through years of observation and study would be tested in the most public way possible. The Pentagon officials would either witness a transformed training program that demonstrated Fort Blackstone's commitment to excellence, or they would observe a chaotic failure that proved the installation was unprepared for modern military realities. Elena's recommendations were about to receive the ultimate validation or face devastating rejection. The morning briefing that had begun with routine administrative matters had evolved into a crisis that would determine multiple careers and the future of an entire military installation. Elena Vasquez, the drill sergeant whose insights had been consistently overlooked, suddenly found herself at the center of Fort Blackstone's most important challenge. Her expertise would either save the day or confirm that institutional prejudices existed for valid reasons. The next few hours would reveal whether competence could triumph over convention when everything was on the line. As officers dispersed to begin implementing Elena's recommendations, she remained in the conference room, reviewing her documentation one final time. The proposals that had collected dust for months were about to be tested under the most demanding circumstances possible. Elena had prepared for this moment through countless hours of analysis and observation, but theoretical knowledge was very different from practical application under pressure. The Pentagon evaluation would determine whether her insights represented genuine expertise or merely the illusions of an ambitious drill sergeant who had overestimated her own capabilities. The resignation letter in her desk drawer seemed like a relic from another lifetime. Elena had been ready to abandon a military career that offered no recognition for her contributions, but circumstances had created an opportunity to prove her worth in the most dramatic way possible. Success would validate everything she believed about leadership, innovation, and the importance of listening to expertise regardless of its source. Failure would confirm that some barriers were insurmountable and that institutional change required more than individual competence. Elena gathered her materials and prepared to supervise the most intensive training modification in Fort Blackstone's history. The drill sergeant who had been invisible for months was about to become the most important person on the installation. Her knowledge would either transform military training or result in a catastrophic failure that would end multiple careers. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and Elena Vasquez was ready to discover whether 18 months of frustration and dismissal had been preparing her for this exact moment. The Georgia sun climbed higher into the humid sky as Elena left the conference room to begin implementing changes that would determine Fort Blackstone's future. Behind her, officers were already making phone calls and issuing orders based on recommendations they had been ignoring for months. The institutional machinery that had marginalized Elena's contributions was now mobilizing to implement her vision with unprecedented urgency. The drill sergeant who had been planning to quit was about to discover whether the military was capable of recognizing excellence when survival depended on it. The transformation of Fort Blackstone's training program would either represent a triumph of competence over prejudice or confirm that some challenges were beyond the capabilities of even the most dedicated professionals. Elena's expertise was about to face the ultimate test, and the results would reverberate throughout the military hierarchy. The morning that had begun with thoughts of resignation was evolving into the most important day of Elena's career, and possibly the most significant evaluation in Fort Blackstone's history. The training grounds that had seemed so familiar just hours earlier now represented a battlefield where Elena would prove her worth or face definitive rejection. Every recommendation she had made would be scrutinized by Pentagon officials who could make or break careers with their assessments. The drill sergeant who had been overlooked and underestimated was about to become the focal point of an evaluation that would determine whether innovation could overcome institutional inertia. When everything was at stake, Elena's hands remained steady despite the magnitude of the challenge ahead. Months of preparation and analysis had led to this moment when theoretical expertise would meet practical reality under the most demanding circumstances possible. Pentagon evaluation would either validate her approach to military training or prove that some ambitions were beyond the reach of drill sergeants who dared to think beyond their assigned roles. Fort Blackstone's future hung in the balance, and Elena Vasquez was the only person who could tip the scales toward success. The installation that had dismissed Elena's contributions for months now depended entirely on her expertise for survival. The irony was profound, but Elena felt no satisfaction in the reversal of fortune. Her focus remained on the practical challenges of implementing comprehensive changes under impossible time constraints. The evaluation would measure not just her recommendations but her ability to execute complex modifications while maintaining the training standards that kept soldiers alive in combat situations. As Elena walked toward the training areas where her theories would become reality, she carried the hopes and fears of everyone at Fort Blackstone. The drill sergeant who had been invisible was about to become either a hero or a cautionary tale about the dangers of exceeding institutional expectations. The next few hours would determine whether competence could overcome prejudice when survival was the ultimate motivation. And Elena Vasquez was ready to discover the answer regardless of the personal cost. The obstacle course at Fort Blackstone stretched across 3 acres of carefully maintained terrain, its wooden barriers and rope climbs designed to test every aspect of recruit conditioning. Elena stood at the starting line, clipboard in hand, watching as maintenance crews scrambled to implement her safety modifications with surgical precision. The Pentagon evaluation team would arrive in 4 hours, and every adjustment had to be perfect if Fort Blackstone was going to survive the most important assessment in its history. Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Santos approached with obvious skepticism etched across her weathered features. Santos had overseen obstacle course operations for 8 years, and she didn't appreciate suggestions from anyone about how to manage her domain. Her resistance to Elena's modifications represented the institutional inertia that had kept dangerous practices in place, despite mounting evidence of their inadequacy. Santos viewed the emergency changes as an insult to her professional competence and a threat to established procedures that had worked adequately for nearly a decade. Elena understood Santos's hostility, but couldn't allow personal pride to compromise recruit safety or evaluation success. The obstacle course modifications she had recommended addressed specific vulnerabilities that could result in serious if left unchanged. The rope climb stations needed additional safety lines because the current configuration created unnecessary fall risks. The wall scaling sections required modified handholds because the existing grips had become slippery with use and weather exposure. The balance beam obstacles needed stabilization because recent inspections had revealed structural weaknesses that could collapse under recruit weight. Santos crossed her arms defensively as Elena explained the technical rationale behind each modification. The veteran warrant officer had built her reputation on maintaining accident-free operations, but Elena's analysis revealed that several near misses had been classified as minor incidents rather than warning signs of systemic problems. The documentation Elena presented showed clear patterns of equipment degradation and procedural gaps that Santos had either missed or chosen to ignore. Confronting these deficiencies required admitting that current practices were inadequate, a conclusion that Santos found professionally threatening. The maintenance crews worked with unprecedented urgency as Elena supervised every adjustment. Personally, the safety modifications required precision installation because improper implementation could create new hazards while attempting to eliminate existing risks. Elena's recommendations included specific measurements, materials requirements, and installation procedures based on her analysis of accident reports and equipment specifications. The technical details reflected months of careful study, but implementing them correctly required constant oversight and immediate correction of any deviations from the established plans. Master Sergeant Chun arrived at the obstacle course with a team of instructors who would demonstrate the modified procedures for Pentagon observers. Chun had initially expressed private doubts about Elena's recommendations, but the morning's crisis had convinced him that conventional approaches were insufficient for surviving rigorous evaluation. The instructors under his command represented Fort Blackstone's most experienced personnel, but even they would need time to adapt to the procedural changes Elena had developed. Success would require seamless coordination between modifications and training protocols. Elena gathered the instructor team around the first obstacle station to explain the updated safety procedures. The new protocols required additional spotting positions during rope climbs, modified hand signals for communication between instructors, and revised timing sequences that allowed for more thorough safety checks between recruit attempts. The changes weren't merely cosmetic adjustments designed to impress evaluators. They were fundamental improvements that addressed documented safety gaps while maintaining the physical and mental challenges that made obstacle course training effective. The instructors listened with varying degrees of enthusiasm as Elena detailed each procedural modification. Some recognized the value of improved safety protocols and appreciated the thoroughness of her analysis. Others viewed the changes as unnecessary complications that would slow down training schedules and require additional effort from already overworked personnel. Elena knew that instructor buy-in was crucial for successful implementation, but she also understood that time constraints prevented extensive consultation and consensus building. The modifications would be implemented regardless of individual preferences because Fort Blackstone's survival depended on demonstrating excellence to Pentagon observers. Chief Santos maintained her hostile posture throughout Elena's briefing, occasionally interjecting technical objections that reflected her resistance to change rather than legitimate concerns about safety or effectiveness. Elena addressed each objection with patient professionalism, providing detailed explanations that demonstrated her understanding of both current procedures and proposed improvements. The exchange revealed the fundamental difference between institutional inertia and innovative thinking, with Santos representing established practices and Elena advocating for evidence-based modifications. The first test of Elena's modifications came when a recruit company arrived for routine obstacle course training. Elena positioned herself where she could observe every station while maintaining communication with all instructor teams. The modified safety protocols were implemented flawlessly, with instructors adapting to new procedures more quickly than anticipated. The additional spotting positions prevented 2 potential falls that might have resulted in injuries under the previous configuration. The revised communication signals eliminated confusion that had previously created dangerous gaps in safety coverage. Chief Santos watched the demonstration with grudging acknowledgement that Elena's modifications were functioning effectively. The recruit performance remained challenging while safety margins improved significantly. The training schedule actually moved more efficiently because better organization reduced the delays caused by equipment problems and procedural confusion. Santos realized that her resistance to change had been based more on personal pride than professional assessment, but institutional momentum made it difficult to acknowledge that her methods had been inadequate. Elena's attention was suddenly diverted by urgent radio traffic from the urban combat simulation area. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's voice carried obvious distress as she reported that the scenario modifications weren't functioning as planned. The updated tactics Elena had recommended were creating confusion among instructor teams who had been rehearsing different procedures for months. Recruits were struggling with unfamiliar scenarios, while observers noted inconsistencies between stated objectives and actual execution. The urban combat simulation was degenerating into chaos just hours before Pentagon evaluation teams would witness the demonstration. Elena left Master Sergeant Chun in charge of obstacle course operations and rushed toward the urban simulation area with growing concern. The combat scenarios represented the most complex element of her recommendations because they required coordination between multiple instructor teams, technical support personnel, and recruit companies. Unlike the obstacle course modifications that involved primarily physical adjustments, the urban combat changes required fundamental shifts in tactical thinking and procedural execution. Implementing these modifications successfully demanded not just technical competence, but leadership skills that Elena had never been allowed to demonstrate. The urban combat simulation area resembled a small town constructed specifically for military training purposes. Buildings, streets, and obstacles created realistic environments where recruits learned to navigate complex tactical situations under instructor supervision. Elena's recommendations had updated the scenarios to reflect current battlefield realities rather than outdated approaches that prepared soldiers for conflicts that no longer existed. The modifications required instructors to think differently about urban warfare, while maintaining safety standards that protected recruits from unnecessary risks. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez met Elena at the simulation entrance with barely controlled panic evident in her voice and posture. The instructor teams were struggling to implement tactical modifications they didn't fully understand. Recruit companies were becoming confused by scenarios that differed significantly from their previous training experiences. Technical support. Personnel were having difficulty coordinating equipment requirements for the updated procedures. The entire simulation was approaching systemic failure at exactly the moment when Pentagon observers would expect flawless execution, Elena assessed. The situation with calm professionalism, despite the obvious magnitude of the crisis. The urban combat modifications she had recommended were technically sound, but their implementation required more comprehensive preparation than time constraints had allowed. The instructor teams needed detailed briefings on tactical rationale and procedural execution. The recruit companies needed orientation sessions that explained how updated scenarios related to their previous training. The technical support teams needed clear guidance on equipment configuration and coordination requirements. The fundamental problem wasn't with Elena's recommendations, but with the institutional assumption that complex modifications could be implemented without adequate preparation time. The obstacle course changes had succeeded because they involved primarily physical adjustments that could be explained and demonstrated quickly. The urban combat modifications required deeper understanding of tactical principles and strategic thinking that couldn't be conveyed through brief explanations. Elena realized that saving the simulation would require her to assume direct command of the entire operation. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez recognized that Elena was the only person who understood the modifications well enough to guide their implementation under pressure. The traditional command structure that had marginalized Elena's contributions for months was suddenly irrelevant because survival required expertise rather than rank. Martinez made the unprecedented decision to grant Elena temporary authority over the urban combat simulation, effectively placing a drill sergeant in command of operations that normally required field-grade officer oversight. Elena accepted the responsibility with full awareness that failure would end her military career, while success might fundamentally change how the institution viewed her capabilities. The next 3 hours would determine whether her tactical knowledge was sufficient to guide complex operations under intense pressure. The Pentagon evaluation team would either witness a demonstration of innovative military training or observe a catastrophic failure that would damage multiple careers and institutional credibility. The instructor teams gathered around Elena as she outlined the tactical rationale behind each scenario modification. The updated procedures reflected current battlefield realities, where urban warfare required different approaches than traditional combat situations. Recruits needed experience with improvised explosive device detection, civilian population management, and multi-level building clearance techniques that previous scenarios had ignored. The modifications weren't arbitrary changes but essential updates that prepared soldiers for actual combat deployments. Elena's explanations gradually transformed instructor skepticism into professional understanding. The veteran sergeants recognized that her tactical knowledge was based on serious study rather than theoretical speculation. The scenario modifications addressed real deficiencies in current training while maintaining the intensity and challenge that made urban combat simulation effective. Elena demonstrated command presence that impressed instructors who had previously viewed her as just another drill sergeant with ideas above her station. The technical support teams received detailed guidance on equipment configuration and coordination procedures. Elena's understanding of both tactical requirements and technical specifications allowed her to bridge the gap between operational objectives and practical implementation. The communications equipment needed different positioning to support updated scenarios. The weapon systems required modified safety protocols that reflected new tactical approaches. The medical support teams needed repositioning that anticipated different casualty patterns from the revised procedures. Chief Warrant Officer Santos arrived at the urban simulation area with obvious curiosity about Elena's expanded responsibilities. Santos had observed the successful obstacle course implementation and was beginning to reassess her resistance to Elena's recommendations. The sight of a drill sergeant directing field-grade operations challenged Santos's assumptions about military hierarchy and competence distribution. Elena's calm professionalism under pressure demonstrated leadership qualities that Santos had never observed in the institutional setting that typically constrained Elena's opportunities. The first test run of the modified urban combat scenario proceeded with careful oversight from Elena and nervous observation from Lieutenant Colonel Martinez. The instructor teams executed the updated procedures with growing confidence as they recognized the tactical advantages of Elena's modifications. The recruit companies adapted to new challenges while maintaining the intensity and focus that characterized effective training. The technical support teams coordinated equipment and communications with improved efficiency that reflected Elena's organizational guidance. Elena positioned herself where she could monitor all aspects of the simulation while maintaining communication with every team involved in the operation. Her radio crackled with reports from various stations as the scenario progressed through its planned phases. Building clearance procedures unfolded according to updated protocols. Civilian interaction scenarios tested recruit judgment under realistic conditions. Medical evacuation exercises demonstrated improved coordination between combat and support elements. The simulation was functioning exactly as Elena had envisioned when she developed her recommendations months earlier. The success of the urban combat modifications created momentum that spread throughout Fort Blackstone as word of Elena's leadership spread among personnel who had witnessed the transformation. Officers who had dismissed her contributions for months were suddenly reevaluating their assumptions about competence and authority. Enlisted personnel were recognizing that expertise existed throughout the military hierarchy rather than being concentrated exclusively at higher ranks. Elena's emergency leadership was demonstrating that institutional effectiveness required recognizing and utilizing talent regardless of its source. Master Sergeant Chen reported by radio that the obstacle course operations were proceeding flawlessly under the modified procedures. Chief Santos had volunteered to assist with implementation despite her previous resistance, and recruit companies were experiencing improved safety margins without any reduction in training effectiveness. The combination of successful modifications at both training areas was creating confidence that Fort Blackstone might actually survive the Pentagon evaluation with enhanced rather than diminished credibility. Elena's radio suddenly crackled with urgent communication from the medical training area, where the third major evaluation component was experiencing critical difficulties. Captain Maria Rodriguez's voice carried obvious distress as she reported that the medical response scenario was collapsing under the weight of coordination failures and procedural confusion. The emergency medical training that Elena had redesigned was failing to function as planned, threatening to undermine all the progress achieved at the obstacle course and urban combat areas. The medical response scenario represented the most complex element of Elena's recommendations because it required coordination between combat simulations, medical procedures, and evacuation protocols. Unlike the other training areas that could function independently, the medical scenario depended on seamless integration between multiple systems and personnel teams. Elena had designed comprehensive modifications that addressed documented deficiencies, but implementation required technical expertise and leadership skills that exceeded the capabilities of current medical training personnel. Elena realized that her emergency leadership role was expanding beyond anything she had anticipated when the crisis began. The Pentagon evaluation would assess Fort Blackstone's effectiveness across all training areas, meaning failure in medical response would compromise the entire evaluation regardless of successes elsewhere. Elena's expertise was being tested across domains that extended far beyond her official responsibilities as a drill sergeant. The institutional crisis was revealing capabilities that normal circumstances never allowed her to demonstrate. "Lieutenant." Colonel Martinez's voice came through Elena's radio with barely controlled desperation. The medical training area needed Elena's immediate attention because Captain Rodriguez lacked the technical knowledge to implement the complex modifications Elena had designed. The traditional command structure was proving inadequate for managing the sophisticated coordination required by updated procedures. Elena would need to assume direct responsibility for medical training operations in addition to her ongoing oversight of urban combat scenarios. The decision to grant Elena authority over multiple training areas represented an unprecedented departure from military hierarchy and protocol. Drill sergeants didn't command training operations that normally required field-grade officer oversight. Elena's emergency leadership was challenging fundamental assumptions about competence distribution and authority relationships within the military structure. The institutional desperation created by the evaluation crisis was forcing Fort Blackstone to recognize expertise wherever it existed rather than limiting recognition to predetermined categories. Elena coordinated her response to the medical training crisis while maintaining oversight of urban combat operations through radio communication and delegated authority. Master Sergeant Chen agreed to serve as her liaison for ongoing urban simulation, monitoring while Elena addressed the medical scenario collapse. The unprecedented command arrangement reflected the reality that Elena had become Fort Blackstone's most important person, regardless of her official rank or position within the traditional hierarchy. The medical training area buzzed with controlled chaos as Elena arrived to assess the situation personally. Captain Rodriguez met her with obvious relief and professional acknowledgement that Elena's expertise was essential for resolving the crisis. The medical scenario modifications required coordination between combat medic training, evacuation procedures, and hospital simulation protocols that Rodriguez couldn't manage without detailed guidance. Elena's comprehensive understanding of the interconnected systems made her the only person capable of organizing successful implementation. Elena surveyed the medical training area with systematic attention to every detail that could affect evaluation success. The scenario modifications she had designed required precise timing between simulated casualties, medical response teams, and evacuation coordination. The technical equipment needed specific configuration that reflected updated protocols. The personnel assignments required adjustment based on the modified procedures Elena had developed. Success would require the same combination of technical expertise and leadership, competence that had transformed the obstacle course and urban combat operations. The medical training crisis represented Elena's final test before Pentagon observers arrived to conduct their evaluation. Her ability to resolve the complex coordination failures would determine whether Fort Blackstone survived the assessment or faced institutional consequences that could end multiple careers. Elena's expertise was being tested across every aspect of military training, revealing capabilities that months of routine operations had never allowed her to demonstrate. The drill sergeant who had been planning to resign was about to discover whether her knowledge could save an entire installation when everything was at stake. The clock on the medical training building showed 1400 hours, meaning Pentagon observers would arrive in less than 2 hours. Elena's emergency leadership had already transformed 2 major training areas, but success required flawless execution across all evaluation components. The medical scenario represented her most challenging test because it demanded coordination between systems that she had studied but never directly commanded. Elena's theoretical expertise was about to face practical reality under the most demanding circumstances possible. Captain Rodriguez briefed Elena on the specific failures that had created the medical training crisis. The coordination between combat scenarios and medical response wasn't functioning because personnel didn't understand how the modified procedures integrated with existing protocols. The evacuation timing was incorrect because the updated scenarios required different casualty patterns than previous training had established. The equipment configuration was inadequate because the technical specifications Elena had recommended weren't being implemented correctly by support personnel, who lacked detailed understanding of the rationale behind each modification. Elena recognized that the medical training crisis resulted from the same institutional problems that had created difficulties in other areas. Complex modifications required comprehensive understanding that couldn't be achieved through brief explanations or superficial training. The technical specifications Elena had developed reflected months of careful analysis, but implementing them successfully required personnel who understood both the details and the underlying principles that made the modifications necessary. The solution required Elena to assume direct command of medical training operations while providing detailed guidance to every person involved in the scenario execution. The unprecedented authority she was being granted reflected institutional recognition that expertise was more important than rank when survival was at stake. Elena's emergency leadership was demonstrating that competence could overcome traditional hierarchies when circumstances demanded maximum performance from available resources. Elena gathered the medical training personnel and began explaining the rationale behind each modification with the same systematic approach that had succeeded in other training areas. The updated scenarios reflected current battlefield medical realities where combat medics faced different challenges than traditional training had addressed. Casualty patterns required different evacuation procedures. Equipment requirements demanded updated coordination protocols. Personnel assignments needed modification based on the revised operational tempo that modern combat deployments created. The medical training teams listened with growing understanding as Elena detailed each procedural change and its tactical significance. The veteran medics recognized that her modifications addressed real deficiencies in current training while maintaining the intensity and realism that made medical scenario training effective. Elena's technical knowledge impressed personnel, who had assumed that drill sergeants lacked the sophisticated understanding necessary for designing complex training modifications. The coordination between combat simulation and medical response required precise timing that Elena supervised personally while maintaining radio communication with other training areas. The modified scenarios created realistic casualty patterns that tested medic capabilities under conditions that reflected actual combat deployments. The evacuation procedures incorporated updated protocols that improved efficiency while maintaining safety standards. The hospital simulation component functioned according to Elena's specifications with technical precision that validated her comprehensive understanding of medical training requirements. Elena's emergency leadership had transformed Fort Blackstone's training program through expertise and competence rather than rank or authority. The drill sergeant who had been dismissed and overlooked for months had become the most important person on the installation when institutional survival required maximum performance. The Pentagon evaluation would either validate Elena's approach to military training or demonstrate that some challenges exceeded the capabilities of even the most knowledgeable personnel when time constraints prevented adequate preparation. The transformation of Fort Blackstone's training operations represented more than just successful crisis management. Elena's leadership was demonstrating that institutional effectiveness required recognizing and utilizing expertise regardless of its source within the military hierarchy. The emergency had revealed capabilities that routine operations never allowed to surface, challenging fundamental assumptions about competence distribution and leadership potential. Elena's success was proving that innovation could overcome institutional inertia when circumstances demanded excellence rather than conformity. The radio crackled with reports from all training areas as Elena coordinated the final preparations for Pentagon evaluation. The obstacle course was functioning flawlessly under modified safety procedures. The urban combat simulation was executing updated scenarios with tactical precision. The medical training area was demonstrating improved coordination and effectiveness. Elena's comprehensive modifications had transformed Fort Blackstone from an installation facing potential failure into a demonstration of innovative military training excellence. The approach of Pentagon observers would test every aspect of Elena's emergency leadership and tactical expertise. The evaluation would either validate her contributions and transform her military career or demonstrate that institutional recognition required more than individual competence. Elena had proven her capabilities under the most demanding circumstances possible, but the ultimate judgment would come from officials who would assess Fort Blackstone's effectiveness according to standards that might not recognize the extraordinary leadership that had made success possible. Elena's position at the center of Fort Blackstone's transformation reflected both opportunity and vulnerability. Her expertise had saved the installation from evaluation failure, but her success depended on continued performance under intense scrutiny. The Pentagon observers would witness training operations that functioned according to Elena's specifications, but they might not recognize the individual contribution that had made excellence possible. Elena's future would depend on whether institutional memory preserved the lessons of her emergency leadership or reverted to previous assumptions about competence and authority. The drill sergeant who had been planning to resign had become Fort Blackstone's most valuable asset when crisis demanded maximum performance. Elena's expertise was about to face the ultimate test as Pentagon observers evaluated training operations that reflected her vision and leadership. Success would validate everything she believed about military effectiveness and individual potential. Failure would confirm that some barriers remained insurmountable regardless of competence or dedication. The next few hours would determine Elena's future and Fort Blackstone's reputation within the military hierarchy that controlled both their destinies. The black government sedan rolled through Fort Blackstone's main gate at exactly 14:30 hours, its tinted windows concealing the Pentagon evaluation team that would determine the installation's future within the next 6 hours. Elena watched from the medical training area as the vehicle proceeded toward the headquarters building, knowing that her emergency leadership would soon face scrutiny from officials who possessed the authority to validate or destroy everything she had accomplished. During the morning's crisis, the transformation of Fort Blackstone's training program was complete, but the ultimate test was just beginning. Brigadier General Patricia Hawkins emerged from the sedan with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of military careers. Her reputation preceded her as an officer who demanded excellence and possessed the technical knowledge to recognize inadequate performance, regardless of how skillfully it might be disguised. General Hawkins had built her career on identifying institutional weaknesses and implementing reforms that improved military effectiveness. Her evaluation would determine whether Fort Blackstone represented innovation worthy of emulation or dysfunction requiring immediate correction. Colonel Reed met the evaluation team at headquarters with obvious nervousness barely concealed beneath his professional demeanor. The morning's crisis had transformed his confident expectations into desperate hope that Elena's modifications would prove sufficient to satisfy Pentagon standards. Reed understood that his own career depended entirely on the next few hours, but he also recognized that institutional survival required acknowledging contributions from sources he had previously dismissed. The evaluation would test not just Fort Blackstone's training effectiveness, but also Reed's ability to adapt his leadership approach when circumstances demanded change. Elena received radio confirmation that the evaluation team was beginning their assessment with a review of training documentation and safety protocols. General Hawkins would examine the modifications Elena had implemented to determine whether they represented genuine improvements or superficial changes designed to create favorable impressions. The documentation Elena had prepared over months of analysis would either demonstrate comprehensive understanding of training deficiencies or reveal gaps in knowledge that undermined her credibility. Every recommendation would be scrutinized by experts who possessed the technical expertise to evaluate both content and methodology. The evaluation team's first stop was the obstacle course, where Chief Warrant Officer Santos waited with barely controlled anxiety. Santos had spent the previous hours reviewing Elena's modifications and grudgingly acknowledging their technical sophistication and practical effectiveness. The safety improvements were demonstrable through statistical analysis and observational evidence. The efficiency gains were measurable through timing studies and throughput assessments. Santos realized that her initial resistance to Elena's recommendations had been based on institutional prejudice rather than professional judgment. General Hawkins examined the obstacle course modifications with systematic attention to every technical detail. Her questions revealed deep understanding of safety engineering principles and training methodology that exceeded most officers' knowledge. Elena watched from a distance as Santos explained the rationale behind each modification, giving credit to Elena's analysis and recommendations. The general's expressions remained neutral, but her detailed questioning suggested genuine interest in the innovative approaches Elena had developed. The first practical test came when a recruit company demonstrated the modified obstacle course procedures under direct observation from the evaluation team. Elena positioned herself where she could monitor both recruit performance and evaluator reactions while maintaining radio communication with other training areas. The demonstration proceeded flawlessly, with recruits navigating challenging obstacles while benefiting from improved safety margins and more efficient progression sequences. The modified procedures maintained training intensity while eliminating unnecessary risks that previous configurations had created. General Hawkins observed the obstacle course demonstration with obvious professional interest, taking detailed notes and asking technical questions that revealed her appreciation for the sophisticated analysis behind Elena's modifications. The safety improvements were immediately apparent to someone with her engineering background. The efficiency gains were measurable through direct observation of training flow and instructor coordination. The general recognized that the modifications represented genuine innovation rather than cosmetic changes designed to impress evaluators. The evaluation team proceeded to the urban combat simulation area, where Elena's most complex modifications would face their ultimate test. The tactical scenarios she had designed required seamless coordination between multiple instructor teams, technical support personnel, and recruit companies while maintaining safety standards that protected participants from unnecessary risks. Elena's comprehensive understanding of urban warfare principles would be evaluated by military professionals who possessed the combat experience to recognize both strengths and weaknesses in training methodology. Master Sergeant Chun briefed General Hawkins on the tactical rationale behind Elena's scenario modifications with obvious respect for the analysis that had guided their development. The updated procedures reflected current battlefield realities rather than outdated approaches that prepared soldiers for conflicts that no longer existed. Chun explained how Elena's recommendations had transformed theoretical knowledge into practical training that better prepared recruits for actual combat deployments. His briefing demonstrated the institutional impact of Elena's expertise while giving appropriate credit to her contributions. The urban combat demonstration began with a complex scenario that tested recruit capabilities across multiple tactical domains simultaneously. Elena monitored the exercise from a central position where she could observe evaluator reactions while maintaining communication with all instructor teams. The scenario proceeded according to her specifications with tactical precision that validated months of analysis and planning. Recruits navigated urban terrain using updated procedures that reflected modern warfare realities. Instructors coordinated their activities with improved efficiency that enhanced both safety and training effectiveness. General Hawkins observed the urban combat simulation with the focused attention of someone who understood the technical complexities involved in creating realistic training scenarios. Her questions during the exercise revealed appreciation for the sophisticated tactical thinking that had guided Elena's modifications. The general recognized that the scenarios addressed documented deficiencies in current military training while maintaining the intensity and challenge that prepared soldiers for combat deployment. Elena's recommendations represented genuine innovation that could transform military training effectiveness throughout the armed forces. The evaluation proceeded to the medical training area where Elena's most challenging modifications would face assessment by professionals who understood the life and death implications of combat medical procedures. The coordination between combat scenarios and medical response required precise timing and technical expertise that exceeded the capabilities of traditional training approaches. Elena had designed comprehensive modifications that addressed documented deficiencies while maintaining realistic conditions that prepared medics for actual battlefield situations. Captain Rodriguez presented the medical training modifications to General Hawkins with professional confidence that reflected her growing appreciation for Elena's expertise. The updated scenarios created realistic casualty patterns that tested medic capabilities under conditions that mirrored current combat deployments. The evacuation procedures incorporated improved coordination protocols that enhanced efficiency while maintaining safety standards. Rodriguez explained how Elena's modifications had transformed medical training from theoretical exercise into practical preparation for real-world medical emergencies. The medical scenario demonstration required Elena to coordinate multiple systems simultaneously while ensuring that safety protocols protected all participants from unnecessary risks. The exercise proceeded according to her specifications with technical precision that validated her comprehensive understanding of combat medical procedures. Casualty simulation created realistic challenges for medic teams, while evacuation coordination tested organizational capabilities under pressure. The demonstration showcased Elena's ability to integrate complex systems into coherent training programs that prepared military personnel for actual deployment conditions. General Hawkins examined the medical training demonstration with obvious professional interest, recognizing the sophisticated analysis that had guided Elena's modifications. Her background included combat medical experience that enabled her to appreciate the practical value of updated training procedures. The general understood that Elena's recommendations addressed real deficiencies in current military training while maintaining the intensity and realism that prepared personnel for life and death situations. The modifications represented innovation that could save lives during actual combat deployments. The evaluation team completed their assessment of all 3 training areas within 4 hours, conducting detailed examinations that tested every aspect of Elena's modifications. General Hawkins had observed practical demonstrations, reviewed technical documentation, and interviewed personnel who had implemented the updated procedures. The evaluation revealed that Elena's recommendations represented comprehensive understanding of training deficiencies and innovative solutions that addressed fundamental problems rather than superficial symptoms. Elena waited in the conference room where the evaluation team would deliver their assessment to Fort Blackstone's leadership. The morning's crisis had transformed her from an overlooked drill sergeant into the architect of the installations. Survival strategy. Her expertise had been tested under the most demanding circumstances possible, revealing capabilities that routine operations had never allowed her to demonstrate. The evaluation results would determine whether institutional recognition would follow individual competence or whether traditional hierarchies would reassert themselves once the crisis passed. Colonel Reed entered the conference room with obvious anxiety about the evaluation outcome, knowing that his career depended entirely on General Hawkins' assessment of Fort Blackstone's training effectiveness. The transformation Elena had orchestrated represented either salvation or catastrophic failure, depending on whether Pentagon standards recognized the value of her innovations. Reed had granted Elena unprecedented authority during the crisis, but institutional memory was notoriously short when emergencies ended and normal operations resumed. General Hawkins began her briefing with systematic analysis of each training area the evaluation team had assessed. The obstacle course modifications represented significant improvements in both safety and efficiency that addressed documented deficiencies while maintaining appropriate challenge levels for recruit conditioning. The urban combat scenarios reflected current tactical realities and prepared soldiers for deployment conditions they would actually encounter. The medical training procedures incorporated updated protocols that enhanced both effectiveness and safety margins for combat medical preparation. The general's assessment continued with detailed recognition of the comprehensive analysis that had guided all modifications across the 3 training areas. The recommendations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of training methodology, safety engineering, and tactical principles that exceeded typical institutional capabilities. The implementation required leadership skills and technical expertise that had transformed potential evaluation failure into demonstration of innovative military training excellence. General Hawkins recognized that Fort Blackstone had achieved something extraordinary through individual competence and institutional adaptation. Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion as General Hawkins specifically acknowledged the role Elena's expertise had played in transforming Fort Blackstone's training program. The general understood that the modifications hadn't emerged from committee deliberations or routine institutional processes, but from individual analysis and innovative thinking that had been overlooked until crisis demanded maximum performance. Elena's contributions represented the kind of institutional asset that military organizations needed to identify and utilize rather than dismiss based on traditional hierarchies. The evaluation team's final assessment exceeded Fort Blackstone's most optimistic expectations. General Hawkins recommended that the installation serve as a model for innovative military training throughout the armed forces. The modifications Elena had developed should be studied and adapted by other installations, seeking to improve their training effectiveness. Fort Blackstone had transformed from an installation facing potential mission loss into a demonstration site for cutting-edge military training methodology. General Hawkins requested a private meeting with Elena to discuss her background, qualifications, and career aspirations. The conversation revealed that Elena's expertise extended far beyond what her official position suggested, encompassing technical knowledge and analytical capabilities that qualified her for responsibilities that exceeded her current rank and assignment. The general recognized that military effectiveness required identifying and developing talent, regardless of where it existed within the institutional hierarchy. The private discussion with General Hawkins transformed Elena's understanding of her own potential within the military structure. The general explained that Elena's expertise qualified her for positions that would allow her to influence military training policy throughout the armed forces. The Pentagon was actively seeking officers who possessed the combination of technical knowledge and innovative thinking that Elena had demonstrated during the evaluation crisis. Her emergency leadership had revealed capabilities that could benefit military training far beyond Fort Blackstone's boundaries. Elena learned that her comprehensive analysis of training deficiencies and innovative solutions had already attracted attention from senior Pentagon officials who were reviewing her documentation. The recommendations she had developed over months of detailed study represented exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach that military training needed to address current operational realities. Elena's expertise could contribute to policy development that would improve training effectiveness throughout the armed forces if she was willing to accept expanded responsibilities. The conversation with General Hawkins revealed career opportunities that Elena had never imagined possible when she was considering resignation just hours earlier. The Pentagon was offering her assignment to the Military Training Innovation Center, where she would develop new approaches to combat preparation and safety protocols. The position would require immediate promotion to major and eventual advancement to lieutenant colonel based on demonstrated performance. Elena's expertise would finally receive institutional recognition commensurate with her actual capabilities. The offer represented validation of everything Elena had believed about the importance of recognizing competence, regardless of its source within military hierarchies. Her months of dismissed recommendations and overlooked contributions had prepared her for the moment when institutional survival required maximum performance from available resources. The crisis had created an opportunity for Elena to demonstrate capabilities that routine operations had never allowed her to reveal. Success had earned her recognition that transcended traditional limitations on career advancement. Elena accepted the Pentagon assignment with full understanding that her new responsibilities would test her expertise on a much larger scale than Fort Blackstone's training program. The Military Training Innovation Center influenced training policy throughout the armed forces, meaning her recommendations could affect thousands of military personnel across multiple installations. The position represented both opportunity and challenge, requiring Elena to expand her analysis from local training deficiencies to systemic issues that affected military effectiveness nationwide. The transformation of Elena's career from overlooked drill sergeant to Pentagon policy advisor represented more than individual recognition. Her success demonstrated that military effectiveness required institutional willingness to identify and utilize expertise regardless of where it existed within traditional hierarchies. The evaluation crisis had forced Fort Blackstone to recognize that competence was more important than rank when survival was at stake. Elena's emergency leadership had proven that innovation could overcome institutional inertia when circumstances demanded excellence. The afternoon's evaluation concluded with General Hawkins addressing Fort Blackstone's entire command structure about the lessons learned from the morning's crisis. The general emphasized that military effectiveness required recognizing and developing talent throughout the institutional hierarchy, rather than limiting recognition to predetermined categories. Elena's contributions had demonstrated that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources when organizations created environments that encouraged innovation and rewarded competence. Colonel Reed publicly acknowledged Elena's role in transforming Fort Blackstone's training program and ensuring successful evaluation outcomes. His recognition represented institutional admission that traditional approaches to identifying and utilizing talent were inadequate for addressing complex challenges that required innovative thinking. Reed's acknowledgement validated Elena's contributions, while establishing precedent for recognizing expertise regardless of its source within military hierarchies. Chief Warrant Officer Santos approached Elena with professional respect that contrasted sharply with her previous hostility toward proposed modifications. Santos recognized that her resistance to Elena's recommendations had been based on institutional prejudice rather than technical assessment. The successful evaluation had demonstrated that Elena's expertise was genuine and that her innovations represented significant improvements to training effectiveness and safety standards. Master Sergeant Chun expressed his appreciation for Elena's leadership during the crisis while acknowledging that her expertise had exceeded his initial expectations. Chun recognized that Elena's comprehensive understanding of training methodology and tactical principles qualified her for responsibilities that transcended her official position. Her emergency leadership had demonstrated capabilities that routine operations had never allowed her to reveal, proving that military effectiveness required utilizing available talent rather than constraining it within traditional limitations. Captain Rodriguez thanked Elena for her guidance during the medical training crisis while expressing amazement at the breadth of Elena's technical knowledge. Rodriguez had assumed that drill sergeants possessed limited understanding of complex coordination requirements, but Elena's expertise had encompassed every aspect of combat medical training. Her comprehensive analysis had transformed theoretical procedures into practical training that better prepared personnel for actual deployment conditions. The recognition Elena received from Fort Blackstone's personnel represented institutional acknowledgement that her contributions had been essential for survival during the evaluation crisis. Her expertise had been tested under the most demanding circumstances possible, revealing capabilities that qualified her for responsibilities far beyond her official position. The emergency had created an opportunity for Elena to demonstrate that competence could overcome traditional hierarchies when institutional effectiveness was at stake. Elena cleared out her desk at Fort Blackstone, with mixed emotions about leaving an installation where she had endured months of dismissal before achieving unprecedented recognition. The resignation letter she had drafted that morning remained in her drawer as a reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change when crisis demanded maximum performance from available resources. Her transition to Pentagon assignment represented both personal vindication and institutional evolution toward recognizing expertise regardless of its source. The farewell gathering organized by Fort Blackstone's personnel demonstrated the respect Elena had earned through her emergency leadership and innovative contributions. Officers who had previously dismissed her recommendations now acknowledged that her expertise had saved their careers and preserved the installation's mission. Enlisted personnel recognized that Elena's success represented validation that competence could overcome institutional barriers when individuals possessed the determination to excel despite limited recognition. Elena's departure from Fort Blackstone marked the end of one chapter in her military career and the beginning of another that would test her expertise on a national scale. The Pentagon assignment would require her to address training deficiencies throughout the armed forces while developing policies that could improve military effectiveness across multiple domains. Her experience at Fort Blackstone had prepared her for challenges that would affect thousands of military personnel rather than hundreds. The drive away from Fort Blackstone gave Elena time to reflect on the transformation that had occurred during a single day of crisis and opportunity. The morning had begun with thoughts of resignation and ended with assignment to one of the most influential positions in military training policy. Her expertise had been validated through practical demonstration under extreme pressure, earning recognition that transcended traditional limitations on career advancement based on rank or institutional position. Elena's success at Fort Blackstone represented more than individual achievement. It demonstrated that military effectiveness required institutional willingness to recognize and utilize talent regardless of where it existed within traditional hierarchies. Her emergency leadership had proven that innovation could overcome institutional inertia when circumstances demanded excellence rather than conformity. The lessons learned during the evaluation crisis would influence military training policy for years to come through her work at the Pentagon. The Military Training Innovation Center represented the culmination of Elena's professional aspirations while creating new challenges that would test her expertise on an unprecedented scale. Her comprehensive understanding of training methodology, safety protocols, and tactical principles qualified her to influence policy decisions that affected military effectiveness throughout the armed forces. Elena's journey from overlooked drill sergeant to Pentagon advisor demonstrated that competence could overcome any barrier when individuals possess the determination to excel despite institutional limitations. 6 months later, Elena stood before a congressional committee reviewing military training effectiveness across all service branches. Her analysis of systemic deficiencies and innovative solutions had influenced policy changes that improved training outcomes while reducing accident rates at installations throughout the armed forces. The expertise that had been dismissed at Fort Blackstone was now shaping military training policy at the highest levels of government, demonstrating that individual competence could transform institutional effectiveness when properly recognized and utilized. The congressional testimony represented Elena's transition from institutional outsider to recognized expert whose recommendations influenced military policy at the national level. Her comprehensive analysis of training deficiencies had identified patterns that affected multiple installations while developing solutions that could be implemented across diverse operational environments. Elena's expertise was finally receiving recognition, commensurate with her actual capabilities and potential contributions to military effectiveness. Elena's presentation to Congress detailed how individual expertise could be identified and utilized more effectively throughout military hierarchies. Her experience at Fort Blackstone demonstrated that institutional effectiveness required creating environments where innovation was encouraged and competence was rewarded regardless of its source. Within traditional command structures, the military's ability to adapt and improve depended on recognizing talent wherever it existed, rather than limiting recognition to predetermined categories. The congressional committee's questions revealed appreciation for Elena's comprehensive understanding of military training challenges and her innovative approaches to addressing systemic deficiencies. Her recommendations for policy changes reflected both theoretical knowledge and practical experience that qualified her to influence decisions affecting thousands of military personnel. Elena's expertise had evolved from local application at Fort Blackstone to national influence through her work at the Pentagon. Elena's testimony concluded with recognition that her success represented both individual achievement and institutional evolution toward more effective utilization of available talent. The military's future effectiveness would depend on its ability to identify and develop expertise throughout hierarchical structures rather than constraining innovation within traditional limitations. Elena's journey from overlooked drill sergeant to congressional advisor demonstrated that competence could overcome any barrier when institutions possessed the wisdom to recognize and utilize their most valuable assets. The afternoon session concluded with Elena returning to her Pentagon office, where she continued developing policy recommendations that would influence military training throughout the armed forces. Her expertise was finally being utilized at a scale commensurate with her capabilities, affecting thousands of military personnel rather than being constrained within the limited scope of a single installation. Elena's success had transformed her from institutional outsider to recognized leader whose contributions shaped military effectiveness at the highest levels. Elena's reflection on her journey from Fort Blackstone to the Pentagon revealed that institutional change required both individual competence and circumstances that forced recognition of available talent. The evaluation crisis had created an opportunity for her to demonstrate capabilities that routine operations had never allowed her to reveal. Success had earned recognition that transcended traditional limitations while proving that expertise could overcome institutional barriers when survival demanded maximum performance. The drill sergeant who had been planning to resign had become one of the military's most influential voices in training policy development. Elena's expertise was shaping decisions that affected military effectiveness throughout the armed forces while demonstrating that competence could triumph over institutional prejudice when circumstances demanded excellence. Her success represented both personal vindication and systemic evolution toward more effective utilization of available talent within military hierarchies. Elena's story had become an inspiration for military personnel who possessed expertise that exceeded their official positions, but lacked opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. Her success proved that individual competence could overcome institutional barriers when combined with determination in circumstances that demanded maximum performance. The transformation from overlooked drill sergeant to Pentagon policy advisor demonstrated that military effectiveness required recognizing and utilizing talent regardless of its source within traditional command structures. The legacy of Elena's emergency leadership at Fort Blackstone continued to influence military training policy through her work at the Pentagon while inspiring other installations to recognize and develop expertise throughout their hierarchies. Her comprehensive analysis of training deficiencies and innovative solutions had established new standards for military training effectiveness while proving that institutional survival required adapting to changing operational realities rather than maintaining traditional approaches that no longer served their intended purposes. Elena Vasquez had proven that competence could overcome any obstacle when individuals possessed the determination to excel despite institutional limitations. Her journey from dismissed drill sergeant to congressional advisor demonstrated that military effectiveness required institutional willingness to recognize and utilize expertise regardless of where it existed within traditional hierarchies. The expertise that had been overlooked for months at Fort Blackstone was now shaping military training policy at the highest levels of government, validating everything Elena had believed about the importance of recognizing talent wherever it could be found. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.